Imagine this. You're 22 years old, sitting in a canvas and plywood aircraft at 20,000 feet. The temperature outside is minus 40 degrees. Your oxygen mask is frozen to your face. Below you, an entire city is burning. Around you, hundreds of searchlights sweep the sky, hunting. Anti-aircraft shells explode so close the shockwaves flip your plane sideways. Fighters are climbing toward you from below. Your fuel is running low. You're 300 miles deep into enemy territory, and you haven't even dropped your bombs yet. This was a normal Tuesday night for the bomber crews of World War II. Tonight, we're going to tell you about the most dangerous job in the most dangerous war in human history. We're going to introduce you to the men who volunteered to fly night after night in disguise filled with death. Young men, barely out of school, who climbed into machines that had a higher casualty rate than infantry on D-Day. Pilots who watched their friends burn alive, then got back in the cockpit the next night. Aircrews who knew the statistics, knew the odds, and flew anyway. These are the stories of the bomber crews of World War II. The men who flew through hell and called it duty. The average age? 22. The average life expectancy in combat? 14 missions. A full tour of duty? 30 missions. Do the math. Most didn't make it home. But they kept flying. They kept fighting. They kept dying. Because someone had to. This is their story. Let's meet the fearless pilots who flew missions in the most dangerous skies of World War II. The year is 1940. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany. France has fallen. The Soviet Union hasn't entered the war yet. America is still neutral. The German army controls Europe from the Atlantic to Poland. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, is the most powerful in the world. Britain is being bombed nightly during the Blitz. Cities are burning, civilians are dying. The British Army has been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving most of its equipment behind. Invasion seems imminent. Britain has one weapon that can strike back at Germany, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command. But in 1940, British bombers are primitive. The main aircraft is the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, a twin-engine bomber that's slow, poorly armed, and has a limited range. Crews fly at night to avoid German fighters, but navigation is almost impossible. They navigate by dead reckoning, looking for landmarks in the dark. Most bombers miss their targets by miles. Some can't even find the right city. But they fly anyway, every single night. Because Britain needs to show Germany, and itself, that it's still in the fight. The early bomber crews were pioneers, flying into the unknown. They didn't have radar, they didn't have good maps, they didn't have fighter escorts, they didn't have effective defensive armament. What they had was courage. Among these early crews was a young pilot named Guy Gibson. In 1940, Gibson was 21 years old, flying obsolete bombers on missions that rarely hit anything important. But he kept flying. He would eventually become one of the most decorated pilots in RAF history. By 1941, Bomber Command was expanding rapidly. New aircraft were entering service: the Vickers Wellington, the Handley Page Halifax, and most importantly, the Avro Lancaster. The Lancaster would become the most successful British bomber of the war. It could carry massive bomb loads deep into Germany, but it was still vulnerable, still slow compared to fighters, still made of fabric and aluminum that offered no protection against bullets or flak. The men who flew these aircraft were volunteers. Every single one. Nobody was forced into Bomber Command. They raised their hands knowing what they were signing up for. The training pipeline was brutal. Pilots trained for over a year before their first combat mission. They learned to fly in all weather conditions. They practiced formation flying. They learned navigation, bombing, gunnery. They trained on the aircraft they would fly in combat. Then they were assigned to a squadron and given a crew. A Lancaster bomber had a crew of 7 men. The pilot, obviously the aircraft commander, the flight engineer who monitored the engines and fuel, the navigator who guided them to the target and back, the bomb aimer who actually dropped the bombs, the wireless operator who handled radio communications, and 3 gunners, nose, mid-upper, and rear. These 7 men would live together, fly together, and quite possibly die together. The bond between bomber crew members was intense. They trusted each other with their lives every single night. If one man made a mistake, all 7 could die.
Military blunder number 2. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. Japanese aircraft attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack is tactically successful. 8 battleships are sunk or damaged. Over 2,000 Americans are killed. The Pacific Fleet is crippled, but strategically, it's one of the greatest military blunders in history. It united America for war, ensured that the world's most powerful industrial nation would dedicate all its resources to defeating Japan, and ultimately guaranteed Japan's total defeat. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor was made at the highest levels of Japanese leadership. It was not impulsive, it was carefully planned, and it was catastrophically wrong. Let's examine why Japan made this decision and why it was such a fatal mistake. Japan in 1941 faced a strategic dilemma. Its war in China had been ongoing since 1937. The conflict consumed resources but produced no victory. Japan needed oil, rubber, and raw materials to sustain its military. Most of these resources came from territories controlled by Western powers, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, the Philippines. The United States had responded to Japanese aggression by imposing an oil embargo. Without American oil, Japan's military would grind to a halt within months. Japanese leaders saw 3 options. First, withdraw from China and negotiate with America. This was politically unacceptable. The military would never agree to abandon gains in China. Second, secure resources from Southeast Asia by force, accepting that this would mean war with Britain and Holland and likely with America. Third, attempt to knock America out of the war quickly, hoping that a devastating blow would destroy American will to fight. Japan chose the third option. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Ironically, Yamamoto opposed war with America. He had studied in the United States. He understood American industrial power. He reportedly told colleagues that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. Yamamoto was overruled. The decision was made to attack. The plan was to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, giving Japan 6 months to a year to conquer Southeast Asia and establish a defensive perimeter. By the time America rebuilt its fleet, Japan would be too strong to dislodge. America would negotiate peace rather than fight a long, costly war. Every assumption underlying this strategy was wrong. First, Japan underestimated American resolve. The attack didn't break American will. It united America like nothing else could have. A nation that had been deeply divided between interventionists and isolationists became unified overnight. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a rallying cry. America entered the war with determination to fight until Japan's unconditional surrender. Second, Japan underestimated American industrial capacity. Yamamoto knew this, but other Japanese leaders didn't grasp the scale. America's industrial output was 10 times Japan's. Once mobilized, America could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The ships sunk at Pearl Harbor were replaced within 2 years. By 1945, the U.S. Navy was the most powerful fleet in history. Third, the attack missed its most important targets. The U.S. aircraft carriers were at sea during the attack. They survived. Carrier warfare would dominate the Pacific War. By preserving its carriers, America maintained the capability to strike back. Additionally, Pearl Harbor's oil storage facilities and repair yards were not destroyed. These facilities enabled the Pacific Fleet to operate from Hawaii throughout the war. Fourth, Attacking America brought Britain and its empire fully into the Pacific War. It triggered America's entry into the European War when Germany declared war on the U.S. Japan suddenly faced enemies on multiple fronts, with resources far exceeding its own. Fifth, Japan's strategy assumed America would negotiate after initial defeats. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of American character and political culture. America doesn't negotiate after being attacked. It fights until it wins. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor guaranteed Japan's defeat. It turned a regional war into a global conflict Japan couldn't win. It ensured that American power would be brought to bear with devastating effect. By August 1945, Japan lay in ruins. Its cities were burned, its military was destroyed. Atomic weapons had been used. Unconditional surrender followed. All of this was inevitable the moment Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. After the war, even Japanese leaders acknowledged the attack was a mistake. It violated Yamamoto's own warning that Japan could only run wild for 6 months. It brought catastrophe where negotiation might have preserved something. Pearl Harbor transformed World War II into a series of regional conflicts into a truly global war. It ensured American dominance in the post-war world. It sealed Japan's fate. One attack, one morning, a war-changing blunder that guaranteed the attacker's ultimate destruction.
Military blunder number 3. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union. June 22, 1941. Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Over 3 million German troops cross the border. It's the largest military operation in history. Initially, it seems successful. German forces advance rapidly, encircling and destroying Soviet armies. But ultimately, it's the decision that ensures Germany's defeat. Invading the Soviet Union violated Hitler's own strategic principle of avoiding a two-front war. It committed Germany to a conflict it couldn't win. It created the circumstances that would lead to Germany's total defeat. Why did Hitler make this catastrophic decision? The invasion of the Soviet Union was Hitler's obsession from the beginning. Mein Kampf, written in the 1920s, outlined his plan for Lebensraum, living space in the East. Hitler viewed Slavic peoples as inferior. He saw the Soviet Union as weak, ripe for conquest. He believed that destroying the Soviet Union would secure Germany's future. Several factors influenced the timing. First, Hitler believed the Soviet military was weak. Stalin's purges of the Red Army in the late 1930s had killed or imprisoned most experienced commanders. Soviet performance in the Winter War against Finland had been poor. Intelligence concluded that the Red Army would collapse quickly. Second, Hitler wanted to secure resources. The Soviet Union had oil, grain, and minerals. Conquering it would make Germany self-sufficient and immune to blockade. Third, ideological hatred drove Hitler. He viewed communism as an existential threat. Destroying the Soviet Union was central to Nazi ideology. Fourth, Hitler believed Britain would surrender once the Soviet Union fell. He thought Britain was only continuing to fight because it hoped for Soviet assistance. With the Soviet Union defeated, Britain would negotiate. All of these calculations were disastrously wrong. The invasion began with spectacular success. German forces advanced hundreds of miles. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Major cities were surrounded. By December, German troops were at the gates of Moscow. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse. Stalin remained in control. The Red Army, though badly mauled, continued fighting. Soviet industry was evacuated east of the Urals, beyond German reach. Winter came. German troops, unprepared for the cold, suffered terribly.
The advance stalled. Soviet counterattacks pushed German forces back from Moscow. The quick victory Hitler expected didn't happen. Instead, Germany was committed to a war of attrition it couldn't win. Why was invading the Soviet Union such a catastrophic blunder? Several reasons. First, it created the two-front war Germany couldn't sustain. Germany was still fighting Britain. Now it faced the Soviet Union. Germany's resources were divided. When America entered the war, Germany faced three major powers simultaneously. Second, it underestimated Soviet resilience. The Soviet Union was vast. Its population was enormous. Stalin was brutal, but effective. He mobilized resources ruthlessly. Soviet industry, once evacuated and reorganized, produced tanks, aircraft, and weapons in staggering quantities. Third, it committed Germany to a fight it couldn't win. The Eastern Front consumed German manpower. Millions died. Entire armies were destroyed. By 1945, Germany had lost over 4 million soldiers on the Eastern Front. The military was bled white. Fourth, it created the circumstances for total Allied victory. The Soviet Union's survival and eventual advance westward meant that Germany would be crushed between Soviet forces from the east and Anglo-American forces from the west. Fifth, it ensured Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe after the war. By fighting the Soviet Union, Germany created the conditions for Soviet expansion. The Red Army's advance into Eastern Europe in 1944 and 45 established Soviet control over half of Europe. Hitler's invasion created the Cold War. Some historians argue that war between Germany and the Soviet Union was inevitable. Both ideologies were expansionist and mutually hostile. Conflict was bound to happen, but the timing was Hitler's choice. In June 1941, Germany controlled most of Europe. Britain was isolated but undefeated. If Hitler had consolidated his gains, focused on defeating Britain, and avoided opening a second front, the war's outcome might have been different. Instead, he invaded the Soviet Union. The decision ensured Germany's destruction. By May 1945, Berlin was in ruins. Germany was occupied. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, lasted 12. The decision to invade the Soviet Union made this inevitable. Military historians, including German generals who survived the war, universally agree that Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's greatest strategic blunder. It transformed a winnable war into an unwinnable one. It guaranteed Germany's total defeat. One decision, one invasion, a blunder that changed the world and ensured the destruction of Nazi Germany.
Military blunder number 4. The German decision not to prioritize the Atlantic Wall. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Allied forces land on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion succeeds. Within months, Paris is liberated. By May 1945, Germany is defeated. But this outcome wasn't inevitable. If Germany had properly fortified the Atlantic coast and deployed its forces effectively, D-Day could have been repulsed. The Allies might have been thrown back into the sea. The war could have dragged on for years. The German failure to prioritize defending against the cross-channel invasion was a strategic blunder that cost Germany the war. Let's examine what Germany got wrong and how different decisions could have changed the outcome. Germany knew the Allies would invade. The question was, where and when? The obvious location was Pas-de-Calais, the shortest channel crossing. But Normandy was also possible. Other locations couldn't be ruled out. Hitler put Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in charge of defending France. Rommel inspected the Atlantic Wall and was appalled. The defenses were inadequate. He immediately began improving them. He ordered millions of mines laid, beach obstacles constructed, bunkers reinforced, but he lacked resources. Most of Germany's military was fighting in the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front consumed men, materials, and equipment. The Western Front was a secondary theater. Rommel did what he could with limited resources, but it wasn't enough. More critically, Germany made catastrophic decisions about deploying its armored reserves. This was the debate between Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Rommel wanted panzer divisions deployed near the coast. He argued that the Allies had to be stopped on the beaches during the first 24 hours. If they established a beachhead, Allied air superiority would prevent German reinforcements from reaching the front. The battle would be decided in the first day. Rundstedt disagreed. He wanted armored reserves held centrally. Once the Allies' main landing site was identified, the panzers would counterattack and drive them into the sea. This was traditional German doctrine: concentrate armor and strike decisively. Hitler made the worst possible decision. He split the difference. Some panzer divisions went to Rommel near the coast. Others remained in reserve. But Hitler personally controlled the reserve divisions. They couldn't move without his authorization. This compromise satisfied neither Rommel nor Rundstedt. It ensured that when D-Day came, German armor would be too dispersed to stop the landings and too restricted to counterattack effectively. When the invasion began on June 6th, Rommel was in Germany for his wife's birthday. He had checked weather forecasts and believed the Allies wouldn't invade during the storm that was occurring. He was wrong. The landings caught German forces off balance. Rommel rushed back, but by then the crucial hours had passed. The panzer divisions near the coast engaged, but were too weak to throw the Allies back. The reserve panzers, still waiting for Hitler's authorization to move, sat idle. By the time they were released and reached the front, Allied beachheads were established, and air superiority made daytime movement suicidal. The opportunity to defeat the invasion was lost. Why was this such a critical blunder? Because defeating D-Day was Germany's last chance to avoid total defeat. If the invasion had failed, Allied casualties would have been catastrophic. Political pressure in Britain and America would have made another invasion attempt difficult. The war would have dragged on. Germany might have been able to negotiate some kind of settlement. Instead, the invasion succeeded. Allied forces broke out from Normandy. Paris was liberated in August. By September, Allied armies were approaching Germany's borders. The Western Front, which had been a quiet sector, became a decisive theater. Germany now faced overwhelming force from both east and west. What could Germany have done differently? First, prioritize the Atlantic Wall, deploy more forces to France, build stronger fortifications. Rommel had plans for extensive obstacles and defenses, but he lacked resources. If Germany had allocated even a fraction of the resources devoted to the Eastern Front, the defenses could have been far stronger. Second, deploy panzer divisions properly. Either concentrate them near the coast, as Rommel wanted, or hold them in central reserve, as Rundstedt wanted. Either strategy would have been better than splitting them. The compromise ensured failure. Third, give field commanders authority to commit reserves without Hitler's personal authorization. The delay in committing panzers on D-Day was catastrophic. Hours mattered. Hitler's need to personally control everything created paralysis. Fourth, prioritize defense over offense. In June 1944, Germany was launching offensives on the Eastern Front. Resources were devoted to these attacks. If those resources had been used to defend France, the outcome might have been different. Germany couldn't do everything. It should have recognized that defending against the inevitable Allied invasion was more important than attacking in the East. The failure to prioritize defending against D-Day was a strategic blunder that ensured Germany's defeat. It allowed the Allies to establish a second front. It created the two-front war that crushed Germany. By May 1945, Germany was defeated. The failure to stop D-Day made this inevitable. Second, all 5 blunders involved overconfidence. Hitler believed Britain would surrender after Dunkirk. Japan believed America would negotiate after Pearl Harbor. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse. Germany believed it could defeat an Allied invasion. Japan believed battleships would dominate naval warfare. This overconfidence led to catastrophic miscalculation. Third, all 5 blunders had common roots in poor intelligence or refusal to accept intelligence that contradicted preconceptions. Hitler ignored intelligence about Soviet military strength. Japan ignored intelligence about American industrial capacity. Germany ignored intelligence about Allied invasion preparations. Japan ignored the evidence that carriers had made battleships obsolete. Fourth, all 5 blunders were made by rational, intelligent military leaders who had access to good information and reasonable options. These weren't mistakes made in the chaos of battle. These were strategic decisions made at the highest levels after deliberation. They were wrong, but they were made by competent professionals. This teaches us that even good commanders make terrible mistakes. Fifth, all 5 blunders changed the course of the war. Without the halt order, Britain might have been forced out of the war. Without Pearl Harbor, America might have stayed neutral longer or focused solely on Europe. Without Operation Barbarossa, Germany might have consolidated control of Europe. Without D-Day success, the war would have dragged on. Without carrier dominance, the Pacific War might have been more costly for America. These decisions shaped history. Sixth, all 5 blunders share another element. They were avoidable. In each case, there were people who argued against the decision. Guderian wanted to continue attacking at Dunkirk. Yamamoto opposed attacking Pearl Harbor. German generals questioned invading the Soviet Union. Rommel wanted better defenses in France. Japanese admirals understood carriers were important. The warnings were ignored. The mistakes were made. Let's examine each blunder in more detail, exploring what we've learned from historical research and how these decisions continued to be debated. The halt order at Dunkirk has been extensively analyzed by historians. Several books and countless articles have examined Hitler's decision. The consensus is clear. It was a catastrophic mistake that allowed Britain to continue fighting. But the debate continues about Hitler's motivations. Some historians argue Hitler genuinely believed the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped forces. Others argue he was concerned about preserving his armor. Still others believe he had political motivations, hoping to encourage British surrender through restraint. Recently declassified documents and diaries of German officers present a complex picture. Hitler was receiving contradictory advice. Goering was promising the Luftwaffe could handle it. Rundstedt was urging caution. The marshy ground near Dunkirk was genuinely unsuitable for tanks. In context, the decision to halt wasn't insane, but it was wrong, and its consequences were massive. Some historians argue that even without the halt order, enough British troops would have escaped to allow Britain to continue fighting. The evacuation was already underway.
Naval vessels and civilian boats were en route. Perhaps fewer would have escaped, but Britain wouldn't have been completely disarmed. Others argue that without the halt order, German panzers could have reached Dunkirk before the evacuation was organized. The ports could have been captured. The perimeter could have been collapsed. Without those 3 days, the evacuation would have failed. Hundreds of thousands would have been captured. We can't know with certainty what would have happened without the halt order, but we know what did happen. Over 300,000 Allied soldiers escaped, and Britain continued fighting. That's enough to call it a war-changing blunder. The Pearl Harbor attack remains controversial in historical analysis. Some historians argue Japan had no choice. The oil embargo was strangling Japan. Without oil, the military would collapse within months. War was inevitable. Attacking Pearl Harbor was Japan's only option for gaining the time needed to secure Southeast Asian resources. Others argue Japan could have negotiated. Withdrawing from China, while politically difficult, would have been better than guaranteed destruction. A negotiated settlement would have preserved something. Instead, Japan chose war and lost everything. The debate continues about whether Pearl Harbor was as successful as Japan initially believed. Tactically, the attack was brilliant. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. But strategically, it failed to achieve its objectives. The carriers survived. The oil storage and repair facilities survived. American will to fight was strengthened, not broken. Some historians argue that attacking the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies without attacking Pearl Harbor would have been a better strategy. America might still have entered the war, but without the Pearl Harbor attack, American public opinion would have been more divided. The war might have been prosecuted less vigorously. Others argued this is wishful thinking. America would have entered the war regardless. The oil embargo and support for China made conflict inevitable. Attacking Pearl Harbor changed the timing, but not the outcome. What's clear is that the attack guaranteed Japan's total defeat. It brought the full weight of American industrial and military power against Japan. That was a mistake that sealed Japan's fate. The invasion of the Soviet Union is universally acknowledged as Hitler's greatest strategic blunder. Even Nazi anarchists can't defend this decision. It created the two-front war that crushed Germany. But debates continue about whether Hitler had alternatives. Some historians argue the invasion was ideologically inevitable. Nazism required the destruction of Bolshevism. Hitler's entire worldview demanded it. The invasion would have happened eventually. Others argue that timing mattered. Invading in June 1941 before defeating Britain was the mistake. If Hitler had waited, consolidated Western Europe, subdued Britain, and then turned east, the outcome might have been different. Still others argue that Germany couldn't have defeated the Soviet Union under any circumstances. Soviet manpower and resources were too great. Geography favored defense. Stalin was ruthless and effective. Germany simply didn't have the resources to conquer and occupy the Soviet Union. The invasion was doomed from the start. What's undeniable is that the invasion created the circumstances for Germany's total defeat. The Eastern Front consumed German military power. By 1945, Germany had lost millions of soldiers. The army was destroyed. The invasion also ensured Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe after the war. By advancing westward, the Red Army occupied Eastern Europe and established communist regimes. Hitler's invasion created the Cold War.
Second, all 5 blunders involved overconfidence. Hitler believed Britain would surrender after Dunkirk. Japan believed America would negotiate after Pearl Harbor.
Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse. Germany believed it could defeat an Allied invasion. Japan believed battleships would dominate naval warfare. This overconfidence led to catastrophic miscalculation. Third, all 5 blunders had common roots in poor intelligence or refusal to accept intelligence that contradicted preconceptions. Hitler ignored intelligence about Soviet military strength. Japan ignored intelligence about American industrial capacity. Germany ignored intelligence about Allied invasion preparations. Japan ignored the evidence that carriers had made battleships obsolete. Fourth, all 5 blunders were made by rational, intelligent military leaders who had access to good information and reasonable options. These weren't mistakes made in the chaos of battle. These were strategic decisions made at the highest levels after deliberation. They were wrong, but they were made by competent professionals. This teaches us that even good commanders make terrible mistakes. Fifth, all 5 blunders changed the course of the war. Without the halt order, Britain might have been forced out of the war. Without Pearl Harbor, America might have stayed neutral longer or focused solely on Europe. Without Operation Barbarossa, Germany might have consolidated control of Europe. Without D-Day success, the war would have dragged on. Without carrier dominance, the Pacific War might have been more costly for America. These decisions shaped history. Sixth, all 5 blunders share another element. They were avoidable. In each case, there were people who argued against the decision. Guderian wanted to continue attacking at Dunkirk. Yamamoto opposed attacking Pearl Harbor. German generals questioned invading the Soviet Union. Rommel wanted better defenses in France. Japanese admirals understood carriers were important. The warnings were ignored. The mistakes were made. Let's examine each blunder in more detail, exploring what we've learned from historical research and how these decisions continued to be debated. The halt order at Dunkirk has been extensively analyzed by historians. Several books and countless articles have examined Hitler's decision. The consensus is clear. It was a catastrophic mistake that allowed Britain to continue fighting. But the debate continues about Hitler's motivations. Some historians argue Hitler genuinely believed the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped forces. Others argue he was concerned about preserving his armor. Still others believe he had political motivations, hoping to encourage British surrender through restraint. Recently declassified documents in diaries of German officers present a complex picture. Hitler was receiving contradictory advice. Goering was promising the Luftwaffe could handle it. Rundstedt was urging caution. The marshy ground near Dunkirk was genuinely unsuitable for tanks. In context, the decision to halt wasn't insane, but it was wrong, and its consequences were massive. Some historians argue that even without the halt order, enough British troops would have escaped to allow Britain to continue fighting. The evacuation was already underway. Naval vessels and civilian boats were en route. Perhaps fewer would have escaped, but Britain wouldn't have been completely disarmed. Others argue that without the halt order, German panzers could have reached Dunkirk before the evacuation was organized. The ports could have been captured. The perimeter could have been collapsed. Without those 3 days, the evacuation would have failed. Hundreds of thousands would have been captured. We can't know with certainty what would have happened without the halt order, but we know what did happen. Over 300,000 Allied soldiers escaped, and Britain continued fighting. That's enough to call it a war-changing blunder. The Pearl Harbor attack remains controversial in historical analysis. Some historians argue Japan had no choice. The oil embargo was strangling Japan. Without oil, the military would collapse within months. War was inevitable. Attacking Pearl Harbor was Japan's only option for gaining the time needed to secure Southeast Asian resources. Others argue Japan could have negotiated. Withdrawing from China, while politically difficult, would have been better than guaranteed destruction. A negotiated settlement would have preserved something. Instead, Japan chose war and lost everything. The debate continues about whether Pearl Harbor was as successful as Japan initially believed. Tactically, the attack was brilliant. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. But strategically, it failed to achieve its objectives. The carriers survived. The oil storage and repair facilities survived. American will to fight was strengthened, not broken. Some historians argue that attacking the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies without attacking Pearl Harbor would have been a better strategy. America might still have entered the war, but without the Pearl Harbor attack, American public opinion would have been more divided. The war might have been prosecuted less vigorously. Others argued this is wishful thinking. America would have entered the war regardless. The oil embargo and support for China made conflict inevitable. Attacking Pearl Harbor changed the timing, but not the outcome. What's clear is that the attack guaranteed Japan's total defeat. It brought the full weight of American industrial and military power against Japan. That was a mistake that sealed Japan's fate. The invasion of the Soviet Union is universally acknowledged as Hitler's greatest strategic blunder. Even Nazi anarchists can't defend this decision. It created the two-front war that crushed Germany. But debates continue about whether Hitler had alternatives. Some historians argue the invasion was ideologically inevitable. Nazism required the destruction of Bolshevism. Hitler's entire worldview demanded it. The invasion would have happened eventually. Others argue that timing mattered. Invading in June 1941 before defeating Britain was the mistake. If Hitler had waited, consolidated Western Europe, subdued Britain, and then turned east, the outcome might have been different. Still others argue that Germany couldn't have defeated the Soviet Union under any circumstances. Soviet manpower and resources were too great. Geography favored defense. Stalin was ruthless and effective. Germany simply didn't have the resources to conquer and occupy the Soviet Union. The invasion was doomed from the start. What's undeniable is that the invasion created the circumstances for Germany's total defeat. The Eastern Front consumed German military power. By 1945, Germany had lost millions of soldiers. The army was destroyed. The invasion also ensured Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe after the war. By advancing westward, the Red Army occupied Eastern Europe and established communist regimes. Hitler's invasion created the Cold War.
The failure to defend against D-Day is less analyzed than the other blunders, but it was equally important. If D-Day had failed, the war would have continued for years. Germany might have had time to develop new weapons, jet aircraft, V-2 rockets in quantity, possibly atomic weapons. The outcome might have been different. Germany's mistake was dividing its attention. Resources devoted to offensives in the east should have been used to defend France. The Atlantic Wall should have been a true fortress, not a propaganda term. Panzer divisions should have been deployed according to a coherent strategy, not split ineffectively. These decisions ensured D-Day's success and Germany's eventual defeat. The Japanese focus on battleships is the clearest example of failure to adapt to technological change. Carriers had made battleships obsolete. Pearl Harbor proved it. Midway confirmed it. Yet Japan continued building battleships. This wasn't just institutional inertia, it was strategic blindness. Resources were wasted on weapons that contributed almost nothing to Japan's war effort. These 5 military blunders changed the course of World War II. They shaped the post-war world. They determined which nations would dominate and which would be defeated. But beyond their historical importance, these blunders teach us lessons about military decision-making, strategy, and leadership. First, understand the nature of the war you're fighting. Don't fight the last war or the war you planned for. Fight the war you're actually in. Hitler fought the war he wanted, not the war he faced. Japan planned for the war it expected, not the war it got. Second, beware of overconfidence. Military history is littered with confident commanders who were disastrously wrong. Humility and realistic assessment of enemy capabilities are essential. All 5 blunders involved underestimating the enemy. Third, listen to dissenting voices. In every case, people warned against the decisions. The warnings were ignored. Good commanders seek out contrary opinions and seriously consider them. Fourth, be willing to adapt. The world changes, technology changes, enemy capabilities change. Strategies that worked yesterday may not work tomorrow. Japan's battleship doctrine and Germany's blitzkrieg tactics needed to evolve. They didn't. Fifth, recognize that resources are limited. You can't do everything. Prioritize. Germany tried to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. It couldn't. Japan tried to defend everywhere. It couldn't. Choices must be made. Sixth, avoid wishful thinking. Hoping the enemy will surrender, negotiate, or collapse is not strategy. Reality must be faced. Hitler hoped Britain would give up. Japan hoped America would negotiate. Both were wrong. Seventh, understand that war is fundamentally about resources and will. Industrial capacity, population, geography, and national determination matter more than tactical brilliance. Japan couldn't overcome America's industrial superiority. Germany couldn't defeat the Soviet Union's vastness and population. These fundamental realities shaped the war's outcome. Eighth, remember that individual decisions by commanders can change history. One order at Dunkirk, one decision to attack Pearl Harbor, one invasion of the Soviet Union, one failure to properly defend France, one commitment to outdated technology. These decisions shaped the modern world. Ninth, study military history not to glorify war, but to learn from mistakes. These 5 military blunders cost millions of lives. Understanding why they happened can help prevent future mistakes. Finally, recognize that even terrible decisions are made by intelligent, experienced people who have reasonable motivations. Hitler, Japanese leaders, and German commanders weren't stupid. They made rational calculations based on their information and assumptions. They were catastrophically wrong, but they weren't irrational. This should humble us. If smart, experienced leaders can make such terrible mistakes, anyone can. The key is to learn from their errors. These 5 military blunders, the halt order at Dunkirk, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the failure to defend against D-Day, and Japan's focus on battleships, changed World War II. They determined which nations would win and which would lose. They shaped the post-war world and continue to influence global politics today. Understanding these blunders helps us understand how history unfolds, how individual decisions by leaders shape the fate of nations, how wars are won and lost not just on battlefields, but in the strategic calculations of commanders. These weren't minor tactical errors. These were fundamental strategic failures that changed the course of human history. The halt order at Dunkirk allowed Britain to continue fighting, eventually leading to Allied victory. Pearl Harbor united America for total war, ensuring Japan's defeat. Operation Barbarossa created the two-front war that destroyed Germany. The failure to stop D-Day opened Western Europe to Allied liberation. Japan's battleship focus ensured American naval dominance in the Pacific. Each of these blunders was avoidable. Each was the result of flawed decision-making. Each changed history. As we conclude, it's worth reflecting on the broader implications. World War II killed over 60 million people. It reshaped the global order. It created the modern world. These 5 military blunders were pivotal moments in that transformation. Without them, history would have unfolded differently. Perhaps Germany would have achieved victory in Europe. Perhaps Japan would have maintained its empire. Perhaps the war would have ended differently, with different nations dominating the post-war world. We can't know. But we know that these 5 decisions, made by commanders who thought they were acting rationally, changed everything. They demonstrate the awesome responsibility of military leadership. The decisions made by commanders don't just affect battles, they shape history. They determine the fate of millions. Understanding these blunders isn't about criticizing the dead, it's about learning from the past. It's about recognizing that strategic decisions matter enormously, that overconfidence, rigidity, and failure to adapt lead to catastrophe, that even smart people make terrible mistakes when they don't question their assumptions, listen to warnings, or adapt to changing circumstances. These 5 military blunders changed World War II. They changed the world. They offer lessons that remain relevant today in military planning, strategic thinking, and leadership at all levels.
Thank you for exploring these pivotal moments with us. Thank you for engaging with this analysis of how individual decisions shape the course of the war and the modern world. Remember, history isn't inevitable. It's shaped by choices. Sometimes those choices are catastrophically wrong. These 5 military blunders demonstrate how decisions made by commanders can alter the trajectory of history. The halt order that saved Britain, the attack that united America, the invasion that doomed Germany, the failure that opened France, the obsolete doctrine that cost Japan the Pacific. 5 decisions, 5 catastrophic mistakes, 5 moments that changed World War II and shaped the world we live in today.
Engine failure? Feather the propeller. Adjust power on remaining engines. Decide if you can continue or need to turn back. Fuel running low? Calculate if you can make it home or need to divert to an emergency field. All while flying in darkness at 20,000 feet with people trying to kill you. The stress was unimaginable. Some pilots were natural leaders, calm under pressure, confident. Their crews trusted them completely. Other pilots were less skilled, but still got the job done through determination and luck. A few pilots panicked under fire. Those crews usually didn't survive long. The best pilots developed an intuition. They could sense when a fighter was approaching before the gunner called it out. They could feel when the aircraft was handling strangely. They knew their bomber intimately. Every vibration, every sound, every quirk. That knowledge saved lives. If something felt wrong, it probably was wrong. Trust your instincts. Check it out. Don't ignore warning signs. Many aircraft were lost because pilots ignored minor problems that became catastrophic failures. Bomber pilots also had to land extremely heavy aircraft on short runways, often at night, often with battle damage, often with wounded crew members, often with low fuel, sometimes with malfunctioning landing gear or blown tires. Landing a Lancaster with a full bomb load because you had to abort the mission? Terrifying. The aircraft is at maximum weight. If you touch down too hard, the landing gear could collapse. If you bounce, you might not have enough runway left. If the bombs are armed, a hard landing could detonate them, destroying the aircraft and killing everyone. Some pilots chose to jettison their bombs in the ocean rather than risk landing with them. Better to lose the bombs than lose the crew. Others landed successfully with full bomb loads through a combination of skill and nerve. Emergency landings were common. You'd be flying back across the channel with 2 engines out, losing altitude, trying to reach England. You'd see the coast. You'd cross the beach. You'd look for any airfield, any flat field, anywhere you could put the aircraft down. Sometimes you made it. Sometimes you didn't. Some pilots ditched in the channel. The B-17 and Lancaster could float for a few minutes if ditched properly. Crews would scramble out, inflate their life rafts, and hope for rescue. The water was freezing. Survival time was measured in minutes. Air-sea rescue launches would search for downed crews, but the channel is big and a life raft is small. Many crews were never found. Some were picked up by German patrol boats and became prisoners. Others drowned in the cold, dark water so close to home, but never making it. The pilots who survived their tours were offered various options. Some became instructors, training new pilots. Some were promoted and assigned to staff positions. Some were given the option to fly another tour. A few, like Guy Gibson, couldn't stay away from combat and volunteered for additional missions. Most were just glad to be alive and wanted nothing more to do with flying. Let's talk about the navigators. The navigator sat at a small table in the fuselage, surrounded by maps, charts, instruments, and calculations. His job was to guide the aircraft from England to the target and back. At night, over blacked-out enemy territory with no GPS, no radio beacons, only dead reckoning, and, if available, primitive radio navigation systems. Dead reckoning meant calculating position based on heading, airspeed, and time. The navigator would plot the course before the mission, marking waypoints and landmarks. During the flight, he would calculate the aircraft's position every few minutes. But dead reckoning accumulates errors. Wind pushes you off course. Your airspeed indicator might be inaccurate. Your compass might be affected by the aircraft's metal structure. Small errors compound over time. After flying for 3 hours, you might be miles from where you think you are. Navigators used various techniques to improve accuracy. They would look for distinctive landmarks and correct their position. A river, a lake, a city, anything recognizable from the air. But at night, in darkness, it's hard to see anything. Later in the war, navigators had access to radio navigation systems. G was a system that used radio pulses from ground stations to determine position. It was accurate to a few miles, which was good enough for strategic bombing. H2S was an airborne radar that showed a crude image of the ground below. Cities showed up as bright spots. Rivers and coastlines were visible. It helped, but it wasn't precise.
The navigator also had to calculate the bomb release point. Bombs don't fall straight down. They follow a ballistic trajectory affected by altitude, airspeed, and wind. The navigator would work with the bomb aimer to determine the exact moment to release the bombs so they'd hit the target. If you released too early, the bombs would fall short. Too late, and they'd overshoot. All this calculation was done with pencil, paper, and mechanical calculators. No computers, no digital displays, just math and skill. Good navigators were worth their weight in gold. They brought their crews home. Poor navigators got crews lost, running out of fuel over the ocean or landing in the wrong country. Some aircraft landed in neutral countries like Sweden or Switzerland and were interned for the rest of the war. Better than being shot down, but frustrating. Some aircraft got lost and landed in Germany by mistake, flying into enemy airfields thinking they were in England. The crews were captured immediately. Imagine surviving the mission only to be captured because your navigator made a navigational error. The bomb aimer's job was to actually drop the bombs. In a Lancaster, the bomb aimer lay prone in the nose of the aircraft, looking through a clear canopy at the ground below. He used a mechanical bomb sight, a complex device that calculated the trajectory of the bombs based on altitude, airspeed, and wind. The aimer would locate the target visually or using the H2S radar. Then he would guide the pilot over the target, using the bomb sight. Left, steady. Right a bit, steady. Once the target was in the crosshairs and the bomb sight had calculated the trajectory, the bomb aimer would press the button. Bombs gone. The bombs would fall away, tumbling toward the ground. The aimer would watch them fall, trying to see where they hit. Did they hit the target? Miss? He would report the results to the pilot and navigator. The accuracy of bombing was poor by modern standards. A bomber aiming at a specific factory might hit somewhere in the same city. That's why the Allies developed area bombing, If you couldn't hit a specific target, you bombed the entire area. Saturation bombing. Drop enough bombs on a city, and you'll hit the factories eventually. You'll also hit homes, schools, churches, hospitals. You'll kill workers, families, children. This was the reality of strategic bombing. It was imprecise. It killed civilians. It destroyed cities. Was it effective? Partially. It disrupted German industry. It forced Germany to divert resources to air defense. It lowered German morale. But it didn't break German will to fight. Germans kept fighting until the very end. Did strategic bombing shorten the war? Probably. But by how much? Historians still debate this. Would the Allies have won without strategic bombing? Almost certainly. The Soviet Union was crushing Germany on the Eastern Front. The Western Allies would have won eventually even without bombing Germany. But bombing forced Germany to fight a two-front air war, defending the homeland while trying to support ground forces. That had value. And let's be clear, Germany started the strategic bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe bombed Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, Coventry. Germany believed in terror bombing civilians. They just couldn't sustain it once Britain and America started bombing back. This doesn't make Allied bombing morally right, but it provides context. Now let's talk about the gunners. A Lancaster had 3 gunners: nose, mid-upper, and rear. A B-17 had 10 gun positions. The gunner's job was to defend the aircraft from fighter attack. They manned machine guns in turrets or at window positions, scanning the sky for enemy fighters. When a fighter attacked, they would fire back, trying to shoot it down or at least drive it off. The reality was that gunners rarely shot down fighters. The closing speeds were too high. The fighters were too fast and too maneuverable. A gunner in a turret had maybe 2 or 3 seconds to aim and fire as a fighter flashed past. But the presence of defensive fire made fighters cautious. They couldn't just line up leisurely shots. They had to attack fast and break away quickly. That gave the bomber a chance. The rear gunner position in a Lancaster was the most dangerous. Rear gunners sat alone in a small turret at the very back of the aircraft. The turret was cramped. There was barely room to move. The Perspex canopy offered no protection against bullets. Many rear gunners removed the Perspex at Clinter because it fogged up. They'd prefer to freeze than to have impaired vision.
At 20,000 feet, temperatures reached minus 40 degrees or colder. Rear gunners wore electrically heated suits, but the heating often failed. They wore multiple layers of clothing, but it wasn't enough. Some suffered frostbite so severe they lost fingers or toes. They endured this for hours, scanning the darkness behind the aircraft, searching for the silhouette of a German fighter. The monotony was broken by moments of sheer terror. A fighter would appear out of nowhere, closing at high speed. The rear gunner would shout, "Fighter, fighter!" corkscrew starboard, and open fire. The pilot would throw the bomber into violent evasive maneuvers. The fighter would fire a burst and break away. Sometimes the fighter was hit and went down. More often, it escaped undamaged. Sometimes the rear gunner was hit. A single cannon shell could kill him instantly. The rest of the crew might not even know he was dead until they landed, if they landed. Rear gunners had a life expectancy measured in missions. Most didn't survive a full tour. Those who did were considered incredibly lucky. Ron Smith, whom I mentioned earlier, flew 57 missions as a rear gunner. He was hit 3 times. Once, a cannon shell exploded in his turret, wounding him but not killing him. He kept firing. Another time, his turret was hit and jammed. He couldn't rotate it or get out. He was trapped for the entire flight home. When they landed, the ground crew had to cut him out. He was back in the turret 3 days later. Why? Because someone had to do it. Because his crew needed him. Because the war had to be fought. That's the kind of courage and dedication these men showed. The wireless operator sat at a radio set in the fuselage. His job was to monitor radio frequencies for orders or emergency messages. He sent weather reports. He handled communications with base. If the aircraft was shot down and the crew bailed out, the wireless operator would destroy the radio and code books before abandoning the aircraft. This was critical. If the Germans captured a working radio and code books, they could read Allied communications. Wireless operators also trained as gunners. In aircraft with multiple gun positions, the wireless operator would man a gun when not operating the radio. The flight engineer monitored the aircraft's systems: engines, fuel, hydraulics, electrics. He watched gauges constantly, alerting the pilot to any problems. He calculated fuel consumption to ensure they had enough to make it home. If an engine failed, the flight engineer would help the pilot feather the propeller and adjust power on the remaining engines. If fuel was running low, he would calculate how far they could fly and where they could land. The flight engineer also operated the fuel transfer system, moving fuel between tanks to balance the aircraft and extend range. A good flight engineer could squeeze extra miles out of an aircraft through careful fuel management. Many crews made it home because their flight engineer knew how to coax maximum performance from the engines. All 7 crew members were essential. Lose any one of them, and the mission was compromised. Lose the pilot, and the aircraft was doomed unless the co-pilot or another pilot-trained crew member could take over. Some B-17s made it home with the pilot dead and the co-pilot flying. Some Lancasters had no co-pilot. If the pilot was killed, the aircraft usually went down. Lose the navigator, and you might get lost. Lose the bomb aimer, and you couldn't bomb accurately. Lose a gunner, and you had a blind spot for fighter attacks. Lose the wireless operator or flight engineer, and you lost critical support functions. The crew functioned as a team. They depended on each other absolutely. That's why the bonds between crew members were so strong. You trusted these men with your life. You'd seen what they could do under pressure. You'd been through hell together. That creates a connection that never fades. Many crews stayed in touch for the rest of their lives. They were more than friends. They were brothers. As the war progressed, bomber tactics evolved. The Allies developed increasingly sophisticated methods for overwhelming German defenses. Pathfinder aircraft would fly ahead of the main bomber stream, marking the target with flares and incendiaries. The main force would bomb the markers. Master bombers would orbit over the target, directing the attack by radio. Bomb the red markers. Ignore the green flares, they're decoys. Window. Thin strips of aluminum foil would be dropped to confuse German radar.
The bomber stream would vary its route to avoid predictable patterns. Sometimes they would feint toward one target, then turn toward the real target at the last minute. These tactics reduced losses, but they never eliminated the danger. German defenses also evolved. German night fighters got better radar. They developed tactics like Zemzau and Wildesau, tame boar and wild boar, different methods of infiltrating the bomber stream and attacking from within. German anti-aircraft artillery, Flak, became more concentrated and more accurate. Flak was terrifying because you couldn't evade it effectively. The shells were time-fused to explode at specific altitudes. They would detonate in black puffs that filled the sky. Each explosion threw shrapnel in all directions. A single piece of shrapnel could punch through an aircraft's skin, cut hydraulic lines, rupture fuel tanks, kill crew members. Flak caused more bomber losses than fighters. You could see flak coming, and there was nothing you could do. You just flew through it and hoped. Some aircraft flew through flak fields unscathed. Others were torn apart. It was random. Luck. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was defeated. Germany couldn't replace its losses, fuel shortages grounded aircraft, experienced pilots were dead, replaced by teenagers with minimal training who were shot down on their first missions. Allied fighters dominated German skies. But even a defeated air force was still dangerous. German jets like the Me-262 were fast enough to attack bombers and escape before fighters could intercept. German rocket fighters like the Me-163 could zoom up to bomber altitude, fire a quick burst, and glide back down. German flak remained deadly to the end, so bomber crews kept dying, right up until Germany surrendered. There was no safe period. Even the last missions of the war were dangerous.
Some crews were shot down on what would have been their final mission. So close to finishing their tour, so close to going home, they died anyway. That's the cruelty of war. It doesn't care that you're almost done. It doesn't care that you've beaten the odds so far. It kills randomly, indiscriminately, right up until the last moment. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the bomber crews in Europe were stood down. Many were reassigned to the Pacific to prepare for the invasion of Japan. The plan was to conduct a strategic bombing campaign against Japan similar to the campaign against Germany. Bombers were already hitting Japanese cities. The B-29 Superfortress was conducting high-altitude raids and later low-altitude incendiary raids that burned entire cities. The Tokyo firebombing in March 1945 killed over 100,000 people in a single night, more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The invasion of Japan was scheduled for November 1945. It was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties and millions of Japanese casualties. Then in August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war was over. The bomber crews who had fought in Europe and were preparing to fight in Japan were reprieved. They wouldn't have to fly into Japanese skies. They wouldn't have to bomb Japanese cities. They wouldn't have to die in the final campaign of the war. They could go home. And they did. They came home to ticker tape parades and celebrations. They came home to families they hadn't seen in years. They came home to a world that had moved on without them. Many struggled to adjust. They'd been living at an intensity that civilian life couldn't match. They'd been part of something larger than themselves. Now they had to find meaning in ordinary life. Some succeeded. They went to college on the GI Bill. They started careers. They got married, had children, bought houses. They became part of the post-war economic boom. They built the modern world. Others struggled. They couldn't hold jobs. They drank. Their marriages failed. They suffered nightmares and flashbacks. There was no help for them. PTSD wasn't recognized as a medical condition. You were expected to just get over it, to move on, to be normal again. Some never could. But most somehow found a way forward. They lived their lives. They didn't talk about the war. When they did talk about it, they talked about the camaraderie, the friendships, the funny moments. They didn't talk about the fear or the death or the horror. They locked those memories away. Only with fellow veterans could they speak honestly. Only with men who had been there could they share the truth.
As the decades passed, the veterans grew old. They attended reunions. They visited memorial sites. They watched as their numbers dwindled. One by one, the members of their crews passed away. First one, then another, then another. Eventually, they were the last survivor of their crew, the only one left who remembered. That's a lonely burden, to be the sole keeper of memories that no one else shares, to remember friends who have been dead for 50, 60, 70 years, to carry those memories until you die, knowing they'll die with you. Some veterans wrote memoirs. Some gave interviews. Some spoke at schools. They wanted young people to understand what war was really like. Not the Hollywood version, not the glorified version, the real version. The fear, the loss, the randomness of death, the impossible choices, the moral ambiguity. They wanted young people to understand the cost of war, to understand that freedom isn't free, that peace is precious, that war should be the last resort, not the first. They wanted to be remembered, but more importantly, they wanted the lessons of their war to be remembered. They wanted future generations to avoid making the same mistakes. Did we listen? Have we learned? Or are we doomed to repeat history? These are questions without easy answers. But the veterans did their part. They served when called. They fought with courage. They survived and bore witness. Now, it's our responsibility to remember them and honor their service. Let me tell you one final story. In 2018, a British historian named Patrick Bishop was researching a book about Bomber Command. He came across a reference to a Lancaster crew that had been shot down over Germany in 1944. All 7 crew members were killed.
Their names were listed in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission records. They were buried in a military cemetery in Germany. But beyond their names, nothing was known about them. No photographs, no service records, no family connections, just names on a list. Bishop decided to research this crew. He wanted to know who they were, where they came from, what happened to them. It took him months of research in archives, contacting military organizations, searching genealogical records. Slowly, he pieced together their stories. The pilot was a 22-year-old from Manchester. He'd worked in a factory before enlisting. He'd married his childhood sweetheart 2 weeks before shipping out for training. The navigator was a Canadian, 21 years old, a farmer's son from Saskatchewan. The bomb aimer was 19, the youngest crew member, from Australia. He'd lied about his age to enlist. He'd been in England for exactly 3 months when he died. The flight engineer was 24, from Scotland, married with a young daughter. The wireless operator was 20, from New Zealand. The mid-upper gunner was 23, from Wales. The rear gunner was 21, from London. His family's home had been destroyed during the Blitz. These 7 men from across the British Commonwealth had been thrown together as a crew in early 1944. They'd trained together, flown training missions together, been assigned to a squadron together. On the night of August 12, 1944, they took off on their 8th combat mission. The target was a synthetic oil plant in Germany. They never returned. German records showed that their Lancaster was hit by a night fighter at 1:47 a.m. The aircraft caught fire and went into a spin. It crashed in a field near a small German village. All 7 crew members were killed in the crash. Local German civilians buried them in the village cemetery. After the war, their graves were moved to a military cemetery. Their families were notified. Brief letters. "We regret to inform you." That was it. 7 lives, 7 families, 7 futures ended in an instant. Bishop tracked down descendants of the crew members, children who had never met their fathers, grandchildren who had heard stories. He collected photographs, letters, and family memories. He visited the crash site in Germany, the field where they died. There was nothing there. No marker, no memorial, just a field. He published his findings in his book. He gave these 7 men more than just names on a list. He gave them identities, stories. He made them real. Why? Because they deserved it. Because their sacrifice deserved to be remembered. Because history is made of individual lives, not just statistics. This is true for all the bomber crews. Over 100,000 of them died. Each one was an individual with a story, with hopes and dreams and fears, with families who loved them and mourned them. They weren't just numbers, they were people, and they deserve to be remembered as people. So when you think about World War II, when you think about the strategic bombing campaign, don't just think about the statistics, don't just think about the debates over whether it was justified. Think about the individual men who flew the missions. Think about the 22-year-old pilot trying to keep his crew alive. Think about the 19-year-old gunner freezing in his turret. Think about the navigator trying to get his crew home. Think about the families waiting for news that never came. Think about the courage it took to climb into a bomber knowing you had less than a 50% chance of surviving your tour. Think about the young men who did it anyway, night after night, mission after mission, until they either completed their tour or died trying. That's who the bomber crews were. That's what they did. That's why we remember them. The fearless pilots who flew missions in the most dangerous skies of World War II weren't fearless, they were terrified. But they flew anyway. That's real courage. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. We owe them our gratitude, we owe them our remembrance, we owe them our commitment to peace, so that future generations don't have to make the same sacrifices. Thank you to all the bomber crews who served. Thank you to those who came home. Thank you to those who didn't. Your service and sacrifice will never be forgotten.